Cyberpunk 2077 has to be one of the most hyped games in history. And to be honest, it's justified. I've played almost 24 hours of this game so far and have been absolutely enthralled with the story and the visuals of this entire experience. And while the story and the visuals are pretty amazing and the game is fantastic, I have to give a huge shout out to the developers and the team that's worked on this game because you have done a tremendous job.
Here comes that damned butt.
But the game, even on the PC, does have some undeniable issues that certainly could have attempted to be fixed. And the console versions of this game are, for lack of a better term, rubbish or unacceptable in my opinion. There are actual engine problems going on technically with filling in textures asynchronously and resource allocation not being able to catch up to the actual real-time frame counts of the game. And also frame counts dipping to sometimes below 15 frames per second. Yeah, I'd consider that unacceptable. And I think this release highlights a cultural problem in the software industry. And in order to frame this discussion in a bit better mind, I'm going to provide some context. So from a technical side of things, when you're designing a game for a console, you have a finite set of assets, as well as a tight timeline for budgeting and how you have to complete your calculations. What I mean by that is if you're shooting for a 60 frames per second game, you have 16.66 milliseconds to essentially get all your calculations done and draw calls done and dispatch your call to the GPU hardware in order to hit that 60 frames a second mark. With this budget in mind, you can have a maximum number of assets being pushed through your rendering engine and your engine through the game into the graphics pipeline, and you can provide performance metrics and benchmarks to figure out how much exactly it's going to take and also how much your system and engine can take before it starts dipping below that mark. And if it dips below every once in a while, people probably aren't going to notice. If it's consistently under the mark that you say it will be, people are 100% going to notice that. So you can kind of gauge the playability of it as development rolls on, but the technical feasibility and testing can be determined up front. So after this conversation is had and it's understood from the asset side of things what is needed in order to hit the marks that you need for the goals of the game and hit your design inputs, you can start developing the game. And then when the game goes in through development, more often than not, there's going to be some asks by somebody else other than the technical part of things, whether it's storyline development or even just like on the texture side of things from an artist perspective, or maybe some more models in the scene. And while you can refer to that limit that was provided and agreed upon before, sometimes it's not acceptable in terms of playability or looks of the game, so you're going to have to add it in anyway. So instead of examining things from a technical trade-off perspective, it's done based on look, feel, and playability. Well, now we're starting to get to the point now where maybe adding a few things here and there actually dramatically hurt the point of the system, so you run into a roadblock, and this is where things like crunches happen. There comes a fork in the road where the playability becomes almost unplayable, and to the point where, well, maybe you need to fix something tremendously because there's a major problem with the game. There's a few routes you can take, and crunches will probably be based off of this decision. So the first thing you can do, and probably the most obvious, is redo some of the game engine in order to optimize the throughput for the console you're working on. Well, the trouble here is it's basically like building a home, getting up to the second floor, and saying, we need to redo the first floor in the basement because we need to change the foundational footprint of how this house is built. Typically, that's not what you want to do, and that's a good way to end up a game getting canceled. The second thing you can do is you can ignore the problem somewhat and just add intelligently, I guess, remove bits and pieces of a scene that maybe aren't as noticeable and add some more detail here and there. Or 3, you can simply just scale back on the detail levels or requirements that you have for your assets. And while the third one is probably from the technical side the most attractive, the second one is usually what happens, and in this case I think is probably true. Things just keep getting added to a point where it's a major problem, and now you're causing system level issues. And this highlights a pretty big cultural problem, I think, in the software development world as a whole, because essentially what you're doing is putting more pressure on the shoulders of developers because either somebody wasn't able to correctly interpret the technical feasibility study, or more likely, somebody in the executive team probably says, we don't care, just make it work. And sometimes that just doesn't work that way. But overall, from a business perspective, the executive team is responsible to the board of directors and the shareholders, and essentially what they have to do is provide a true to life looking glass window of how the product is actually going, because they're investing in that product, they have money, and if you mislead the shareholders, that's fraud. So you can actually get prison time for that. And in this case, I'd say the border between misleading and truth is pretty blurred here, because the CEO of CD Projekt Red actually spoke about the console's performance during a shareholders meeting and saying the base PS4 and Xbox One console's performance is surprisingly good. I'd find it difficult to believe that a man like Adam Kuczynski, who has been in games for a while, looked at the base model PS4 and Xbox One versions of the game and said, yeah, that looks good to me. I find that very difficult to believe. So here's cultural problem number one. Engineering teams need to be held accountable for the timelines they produce and the results they deliver. And they can't use remote updates as a cop-out to produce a half-baked game. It's just that simple. Remote updates are a wonderful thing. Being able to provide hot fixes and also remote game updates to fix and improve the game as it goes along have added a ton to game content as time goes on. But the main problem is using it as a cop-out, saying, oh, yeah, we could just remote update it, no big deal, we can fix it later, after the game has been released, I think is unacceptable. If it takes away from the playability of the game, don't do that. And another thing, this game supposedly had about 500 employees throughout the 8 years that it's been worked on in order to make this game happen. Can somebody tell me how 8 years of development on the original consoles that it was supposed to be slated for, the PS4 and the Xbox One, have gotten so convoluted and bloated to the point where there's these tremendous system-level, engine-level performance issues that are bogging down the game? That makes no sense, and I think the engineering team is certainly accountable for that piece of it. So at the end of the day, from an engineering perspective, you have to do a few things. The first thing is effectively communicate in your plan what's achievable technically and also time-wise based on your cost and problem constraints that you have. And if it's not possible to do something that is demanded by the business side of things, you tell them no. And I understand sometimes that doesn't work and you're told to make it work, and I'll get into that next as that's another cultural problem I want to touch on, but push back. Providing a realistic timeline as well as delivering results, they have to be somewhat accountable for that. They can't be woe is me at this point because they are partially responsible for this. But on the converse side of things, there's another cultural issue in terms of putting pressure on development teams and engineering teams to produce unrealistic results. And this could possibly be part of the miscommunication between the engineering teams and the business teams of where the product is actually at. But I think at this point, it's an important question to ask. Why not just delay the console version on the current gen to release with the next gen console? Well, there's a pretty big issue with this, and about 41% of the game's pre-orders were for these current-gen consoles, and it's the holiday season coming up. So essentially, you'd be losing out on a ton of money. And this might be where this unrealistic expectation was thrown on developers, and eventually the perpetual crunch started to happen tremendously. The downplaying of the crunch, multiple delays of the game, just showed that there was a lot of issues maybe with communication in between the engineering department and the business side of things, and also the expectations that are put on the engineers based on the plans that they had set forth. So I think it's a little bit of both here. The unrealistic expectations from the business side and the engineering department after they basically said, you know what, the shareholders aren't going to put any more money into us if we can't produce this game within a regular time frame. So engineering team, make it work. And the engineering team, to please the executive team, probably did the opposite. They said, yeah, we can get it done by this time, but then it's like, you know what, it's a little more deeper in than we thought. We're going to need to rebaseline. We're going to need to rebaseline again, and now we'll rebaseline again. And they probably said after that point, you better finish. So I think there's a couple of cultural differences here, but all I'm going to say to end this video out is most likely it's a both party at play here, but engineering team, you're responsible for your work. In this case, you had 8 years to figure something out. Even if there are multiple story changes and things like that, and changes in content, you have the limits there. You should agree upon those and stick to those. But on the converse side of things, the business needs to understand that technically feasible things have plans and timelines to them that need to be stuck to in order to make a good game. Putting more pressure on the engineers doesn't help anybody. It's a lose-lose situation in both cases. And quite frankly, in this case, it ended up in somewhat of a disaster. Now, I will say this. The game is awesome. I love it. But definitely stuff needs to be fixed on the console side of things. And I really hope it works out for CD Projekt Red because this is an amazing game. And shout out to the developers who crunched so much. Shout out to all the artists and creators that were involved in the making of this game because you all did a wonderful job. If you've worked in the game industry and have some more insight on this particular topic, please leave them in the comments below. I'd love to hear about this and love to hear your guys' thoughts on it. And I'd just like to say thank you for stopping by and watching the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share. And we'll see how Cyberpunk continues on. And I'm especially intrigued to see the next-gen launch happen sometime in 2021. I'm James from Zygal Studios, signing off.